So international law is a capitalist enterprise, right? And I don't think there's any part of international law that isn't integrated and embedded fully within capitalism in this and in various ways. So if we think of socioeconomic rights, so they're part of this welfarist model that makes capitalism viable, politically palatable, and economically possible. If we think about, of course, international economic law, and it's embedded in the right to property and the right to contract, that's quite obvious.
Margot Salomon's name is synonymous with critical thinking and innovation in the field of international economic law. Margot's distinctive outlook on the relationship between human rights and capitalism has yielded valuable insights into this typically complex legal terrain. Despite her profound impact on the subject, she modestly refuses to be identified as an international economic lawyer, which highlights to us her delicate comprehension of the domain. This episode examines Margot's views on the relationship between international human rights law on one hand and capitalism on the other, including its role in both mitigating and exacerbating the consequences of economic globalization. Margot's perspective is based on the idea that international law social awareness, or its social consciousness, as she terms it, is expressed through international human rights law, can be better utilized if we acknowledge its current constraints and embrace its more innovative potential. Margot's insights illuminate the capitalist fundamentals of international law and how these roots impact socioeconomic rights, labor regulations, and really the broader global economic framework. In this thought provoking discussion, Margot encourages us to transcend the binary perspectives of optimism and pessimism and to delve into the dynamic nature of international law while envisioning its potential liberation from capitalist limitations. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fresh Squeezed.
Welcome, Margot Salomon. We're delighted to have you here on Fresh Squeezed, the Opinio Juris podcast. Now, in our invitation to you, we identified you as one of the leading critical thinkers on international economic law. And in your response, you disavowed this label. Can you tell us a little bit about why you don't identify as an international economic lawyer, despite your research into the relationship between human rights and capitalism?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. This is really engaging and wonderful, and I'm delighted to be having this conversation with both of you. So that's a great question and perfectly legitimate. I think that you would assume I'd be interested in international economic law, and I am, of course, interested in international economic law. I take as my point of departure international human rights law, and I'm interested fundamentally in the various roles that international human rights law plays in relation to capitalism and in relation to poverty and development that eventually led to a set of reflections and centering capitalism in a lot of my research. And this can be as a buffer to the worst excesses of capitalism and of globalization. And this can be as a facilitator of capitalism and further embedding it through reliance on growth and through indeed reliance on redistribution, which we can probably come back and talk about. And indeed in my most recent work, thinking about how we might emancipate human rights in order to play an entirely different role in terms of challenging fundamentally capitalism. So international human rights law, political economy, international political economy figures prominently. That brings us, of course, to international economic law very centrally. It's impossible to study capitalism as an international lawyer and not take seriously international economic law. I teach a course on world poverty and human rights, and I teach these various regimes together. But I ground my approach, and I guess what animates my interests and my thinking is the idea that the social conscience of international law, which is international human rights law, might serve us better. And for that, we have to understand how it serves us poorly and what its possibilities are. And that's linked to international economic law and to the international economic order more generally. But it's my starting point and my frame of reference.
So what I'm wondering, and this is the follow-up question that I had in mind, you mentioned capitalism and you mentioned political economy. And of course, we understand then that capitalism is the dominant economic model. And we've seen a lot of critiques recently about the relationship between international law and capitalism. A new journal was launched then exploring specifically the links between PIL and political economy. And we're wondering, would you say then that international law is beholden to capitalism? Is there any way around this sort of capitalist modality that we're operating within?
So the first part of your question isn't beholden. So international law is a capitalist enterprise, right? And I don't think there's any part of international law that isn't integrated and embedded fully within capitalism in this and in various ways. So if we think of socioeconomic rights, so they're part of this welfarist model that makes capitalism viable, politically palatable, and economically possible. If we think about of course, international economic law, and it's embedded in the right to property and the right to contract, that's quite obvious. If we think about the founding of the ILO, which was in many ways which preceded the big push forward of standard setting of international human rights in 1945. So the ILO was established in 1919, and the ILO was in large part a response to the threat of Bolshevism, and it was an attempt to give organized labor some power within the confines of capitalism. So capitalism is embedded and is maintained in very important ways through the structures of international law. A permanent feature, well, I think that's something that's probably something that I'll come back to in almost every question you ask me, because I am, at least within the realm of international human rights law. We might discuss it differently if we look at international economic law, but within the realm of international human rights law is potentially, and I might regret saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, endlessly fluid. And if not endlessly, far more fluid than we've seen its application so far. And so the possibility that it can do otherwise, that it can be emancipated from its commitment to tacitly or explicitly capitalism and furthering in many ways some of the worst excesses of capitalism, I think that's possible. And I see change already, and we might come back to that later. I see that possibility already, and some of it has already taken place, right? That international human rights lawyers working in this area will know very well. In the area of indigenous rights, 20 years ago, where it was a turn to these landmark cases that reinterpreted fundamentally the right to property in the American Convention on Human Rights to apply to indigenous peoples, meaning the collective use and ownership of indigenous lands, really doing away with the interpretation as private property that is long the mainstay. And we see similar interpretive turns within the African human rights system. And I take that a bit further in some of my more recent research. So yes, everything is possible, but the background assumption, socioeconomic rights rely on capitalism for their delivery, right? So it's an uphill battle to change things, but I think that's the direction of travel, not only among international human rights lawyers who think in this way, and we still might be something of a minority, but there's, I think, a movement in this way, but also, incrementally the thinking of the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, even though that might be slower to move by virtue of its constellation and its political embeddedness. But we see change. We shifts in this direction. So is it a permanent feature? No, I think everything's for the taking. But that's not to say that we're pushing up against entrenched assumptions and indeed the rootedness of this discipline and this field in capitalism itself.
So one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is kind of this hopefulness that I feel like a lot of us don't necessarily share. And so I'm genuinely curious about specifically what drew you to this area first and how you maintain that optimism, and why you maintain committed to kind of this the reimagining of and potential, and use the word emancipation, the possibilities of emancipation through the human rights rubric. Disheartening, right? To see this low incremental change, and at the same time see the thinking of certain bodies and the discipline more broadly of kind of pushing back against what could be a transformative rubric ultimately, I guess.
So I guess the place to start would be, and what you're asking about initially is my trajectory, in a way, my intellectual trajectory, and so I started out as an optimist. I mean, I started out in a way as an activist,
as so many of us do.
And yeah, so while I was doing my PhD, I was the representative of an NGO to the UN and to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and very engaged. But that's more so a footnote. I think I entered the academy right after my PhD, but I was committed to understanding the full potential of what we had as a normative framework in its most radical applications and incarnations. But I wasn't challenging capitalism. I wasn't challenging these background structures. I was trying to make sense of what was possible within the normative framework that we had to hand. And I did a lot of work on the time for people who know my work and my background on the right to development. It was a core part of my PhD of very, very long time ago. I did quite a lot of work on for many years on obligations of international cooperation and assistance, which finds expression in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. What that could mean, what rich countries owe to people in poor countries, how we think about those relations, how we assess causation, how we consider, when a state has given effect to its obligations at home, at what point, when there's a moving target of the highest attainable standard of health at home, that's never actually reached for everybody. But at what point are there obligations elsewhere? And how do we think about global economic justice more broadly through the prism of international law? And I was involved in the Maastricht principles on the extraterritorial application of ESC rights and all this kind of stuff. And so that really, my work was animated by a sense of the existence of norms that could give effect to some applications of global economic justice, if I can put it that way. And I wanted to understand how we could apply them and make them better. And I spent quite a lot of time on that intellectually and engaged with others and in my research and my writing. I think at a certain point, I felt that that there were certain limits, and this isn't universally felt in the sense that I have colleagues still working in that area in a concentrated way, doing amazing work. So it's not to say that there isn't a lot left to do on that trajectory, but it wasn't my trajectory to maintain a push towards something better within the confines of what we had. And I kept coming up against capitalism. And so I integrated that and have now really taken on board this idea that we cannot get where we want to be within the current system of radical exploitation at multiple levels that plays out in many different ways, and that we have to recognize where international human rights law, never mind international law more broadly or international economic law, is part of the problem, or in any case not contributing to a greater emancipation and not meeting its objectives, and never will through this model. I think that's a key point, right? We can carry on and help the least well off, help the most vulnerable, demarcate and protect certain areas, address evictions, right? So these things are hugely important. And when we talk about the minimum essential levels of rights or minimum core obligations, right, that is hugely important when you have very little. And so there's a struggle to be had at base with what socioeconomic rights set out to do, including the sort of progressive realization stuff. But it will never end, and it will never get us very far. It just is a fix for the most egregious impacts of the system that we've created. And I want to look more systemically and more structurally at how we address those elements that will forever give rise to the kinds of socioeconomic rights issues that we have, and they're thick and wide and egregious.
So I had a follow-up question to that one, because you mentioned global economic justice, you mentioned improving the human condition, and you also mentioned, or what comes across then, certainly your scholarship and even in your answers today, is a little bit of skepticism then towards the international legal framework as currently constituted. And I'm wondering if it is that sort of contradiction that has led you towards then the work that you're doing on peasant communities. Because you speak of peasants and you speak of the economic culture of peasants and beyond, and you seem to have some hope in what this could offer us in terms of learning, in terms of restructuring the framework. So is that what led to it? And then perhaps you can expand a little bit on what it is that you mean by this economic culture of peasants.
So there's a number of strands to this question. I'll start with one of them. So the peasants, so I do see, and I do increasingly see the fourth world as a world-making project, or in any case, I believe in it, and that's part of this project of emancipation. And the peasants, so building on Indigenous rights, the Peasants' Declaration is extremely important. It's almost radical in very particular ways. The way it focuses on, on local markets, or it focuses on, it has a right to seeds, traditional uses of land, it's small scale, right? It even has a provision on access to the means of production. It's really quite, the idea of a right to seeds is incredible, right? In a time where 90% of seeds are owned by one multinational company. So these are really incredibly important articulations. And so I should say that, in the work I've done, the Peasants' Declaration itself is a mixed bag. And we can get into that or not. Some of the rights there are really rights, that reflect a rise against global capitalism, as I would say it. And they're extremely important articulations. They address concentration in the holding of land and so forth. Other aspects of it, reflect I don't want to say a co-optation because it's too hard and these were so hard fought for, but let's say that they end up reanimating and re-embedding the kinds of problems that the other parts of this declaration are seeking to address, and quite radically so. So it's an amazing piece of work. So I see this as an important contribution, of course, with all the caveats about how far we can get with, first of all, the negotiated language, and that's why we have this compromise language, and with the mechanisms of the state, and with the mechanisms of human rights, and with weak enforcement and all that kind of stuff that we know about. But that said, this is still a really important advance in articulating quite radical claims. And so that's one part of the answer. I think relatedly, I wrote a short piece, a blog post looking at this idea of economic culture. And what I was trying to do was, in fact, to elevate the idea that these new ways of doing things that are a pushback against capitalism and capitalist globalization are not just about their economies, right? Different economies, alternative economies, but actually part of their very culture, the way they live, the way they engage, the way they eat, the way they function in communities, the way they're mutually supportive, the way they're non-exploitative. So these are cultures, these are embedded in the way they live and they do things without essentializing or anything. And so what I was trying to do was a bit of a strategic focus to say, well, within international human rights law, there's a primacy on protecting culture, right? There's a primacy on traditional ways of life. There's a primacy on non-discrimination, even at its most basic levels. So let us think about this economic turn, these radical provisions, and not merely as economic alternatives, but as embedding and necessary for the protection of culture, which comes out far more clearly in indigenous provisions, right? Because the culture element is there at the forefront. In peasants, it's a more mixed bag, right? The Peasants' Declaration protects indigenous peoples and small fishers and farmers and pastoralists and refers to migrants and even landless people. So it's not a culture in the way we would normally understand a cohesive culture that, speaks the same language and so forth, but it's a cultural commitment to a way of life. And in that sense, it's culture. And so I wanted to harness the potential of international human rights law to think about this not just as alternative economic arrangements, but as embedded in a cultural way of life, which then affords them very particular kinds of protections.
You're aware there of the risks then of empowering then the state if we were then to integrate this sort of peasant culture or even indigenous culture into human rights law. So I'm wondering then, are the benefits worth the risk?
So that's a great question. So a couple of things. So I talk about this change in the articulation of rights, and there's sort of a meta change, I would suggest. That's not just about the articulation of these really important provisions about community, communal living, and so forth, the right to seeds, right to reuse, so transcending ideas of private property and so forth. But what it reflects more broadly, and I've written a little bit about this in my Peasants piece from a few years ago, is a commitment to community, obviously. And that commitment to community, I think, is extremely important because capitalism is based on breaking up that community, right? It's based on focusing on the individual. And so as soon as we introduce ideas of communality, of commoning, of working together, I think what I'm trying to suggest is that this is extremely significant because it reflects fundamentally a shift and a radical change from the way in which from what capitalism actually requires. So I think this is really important. But then you ask particularly about engaging the state. So definitely, international human rights law, international law is a state-centrist system. There's a problem, as I see it, with doing international human rights law precisely because it shifts the power from the community to the state, and it relies on the state for the delivery of these solutions. Through that it embeds hierarchy, it embeds structures of dominance. I think there's a number of things that can be done, though, to counter that. I think one is to always think about the engagement as one step in a far bigger strategy. And I'm not the only one to approach it this way, right? That this is not the end game, but this is an engagement that is a step towards a far greater sort of emancipatory strategy or a far greater turn. I think second, always to recognize that the power is fundamentally with the community, and that there should be the opportunity to step away from that engagement with the state when the time comes. And I think there's a third and important point that comes up in discussions around whether, that I've had with a few colleagues and at a couple workshops, is whether and how, I guess not whether, but how international human rights law might be, and the nature of states parties' obligations might be rethought so as to make space for their role in facilitating alternative economies, commoning, and so forth. And what I mean here is that I've talked to a few people about this idea that it wouldn't just be sort of respect, protect, and fulfill, which is the standard way in which we assess states' obligations in this area, but they would have a duty to facilitate, or as one colleague said, to enable the creation, right, of these sovereign communities, right, alternative forms of ownership. And so forth. So the role of the state would be this role of the state would be to limit and effectively do away with the role of the state, if you know what I mean, in empowering these communities to be sovereign and to have shared ownership of their own property and to have forms of economic democracy. So embedding a system that allows the state to take a far lesser role would be part of engaging with the state. So moving against the idea of empowering the state and constantly empowering the state, but making the state's legitimacy contingent on its acting as a facilitator towards these commitments, and indeed commitments that have been articulated in these instruments, such as in the Peasants' Right instruments. So it's a very careful and strategic engagement with the state that doesn't cede power to the state, but makes demands on the state to do something differently.
I'm curious about what role you see for lawyers in this, because as we started the conversation with, you said, there is a limit to what we can do and what we can achieve. And so I'm curious for you to kind of share more about what you see that role as, and the risks for lawyers and the potential for lawyers, particularly those of us who have a more revolutionary tendency. Because, as you said, there is so much work to be done within the current paradigm, but at the same time, there's also so much work to be done beyond it.
Thank you, Claire. I draw inspiration from decades of work that has taken on, been manifest through different expressions and different cohorts and different labels, but really expose and foreground the same issue in many ways. So if we think about, U.S. legal realism and critical legal studies and this community lawyering and poverty lawyering approach that came out of the U.S., I think it was in the 90s, and I read quite a lot of that for my Peasants piece. What ends up being key in my mind is this idea that as we do law, and in many of those interventions, they're thinking about actually being practitioners and litigating, but we can take from that as academics, that as we do law, we don't lose sight of the structures and the background. So if we're focused on the victim, if we're focused on a remedy for a particular harm, for a particular person, and international human rights law, right, focuses us on the victim because you need a victim to bring the case in the first place. So we end up turning to those victims. And what I drew from this, and what I find extremely significant and helps me to think in, if you want, as you put it, and as I've put it before too, in revolutionary terms, is not to lose sight in which that harm was made possible. And in our lawyering, and whether that's as a practitioner, as a lawyer defending a client, as a professor, as an academic, as a teacher, as a writer, and without, as a writer is different because people have academic freedom, of course, in particular ways. But the idea here is really just to think about, never lose sight of what gave rise to those problems in the first place, and always assume that there's many victims, right, not represented there, equally situated, equally harmed, and look for the root causes of those problems and address those and foreground those when you're doing your lawyerly stuff. So I think part of what we do, and part of what we have to do, drawing on a long intellectual and practical history that has taught us as lawyers to engage with the structural and the assumptions that make possible these harms, and to think about these harms with a far greater lens, is part of doing law without backgrounding these problems for the sake of protecting one person, which is always important, as the ultimate unit of international human rights. On the ultimate unit of protection is the person, but not to lose sight of these far greater issues. And certainly not to allow them to be backgrounded for the sake of foregrounding one harm as if it's an isolated incident.
And so how do you spoke about responsibility in my initial question, and I'm curious about how you bring that into beyond, as you said, kind of our lawyerly work and into our teaching and our pedagogy.
So, like everyone, my teaching has evolved over time, and I've matured as a teacher, as a thinker, and as an activist academic, if I can use that term. And I bring that to the classroom. I do a couple things. I foreground assumptions, right? I challenge conventional wisdom. I'm interdisciplinary, so I bring to bear facts and figures from disciplines that help us to situate law, particularly economics, but also international political economy and some economic sociology. I find the philosophers, political theorists can be very helpful in challenging some of our assumptions. So I teach in a nuanced way, taking seriously international. I have a course I'm taking now in particular. I have a few courses, but one on world poverty and human rights. I take seriously what human rights does here and what it can do here, but I also take seriously, right, the whole context. Everything's contextualized. I also, and of course, I pay attention in my reading list to access to the kinds of readings that give them a diverse sense, both within international law, but also outside of international law. My reading lists are rarely exclusively international lawyers, even though that's that grounds our approach and is our entry point. My courses, not only my world poverty and human rights course, but actually everything I teach at the master's level, are open to other programs. So I get LLM students, of course, but I get students from global politics, from international development studies, from the MSc in inequalities, and the MSc in human rights, which is an interdisciplinary human. So I get a lot of students. I get the odd sort of development economist coming in. They enrich the conversations enormously, as you can imagine. But also I bring something to their learning that they wouldn't have gotten, or is unlikely that they would have gotten within their own field. And so I'm committed to opening up my course. And I always get a very good number of students from these other programs. And I think that's really part of doing this stuff properly and maximizing the potential of opening minds and making them responsible thinkers.
I'd like to pick up on this educational question. And you mentioned something about the self-selective nature of your students. So students aren't taking this because they want to get a job at a magic circle firm. They're taking this, quite reasonably because they're troubled by global poverty and would like to do something about it. You have that privilege then of being at this elite institution, self-selecting students who are taking your course, this possibility of this cross program, so getting students then for this interdisciplinary then opportunity, and all of that is fantastic. And what I wonder is, what would you say then to early career scholars? For example, those who are having to almost pay their dues then in those courses that they might not want to teach, but still themselves having this critical disposition and wanting to achieve global economic justice, wanting to improve then living standards for all. Is there any scope for that type of radical thinking, radical engagement across the law school as a whole?
So yes, there is. So I think this turn to decolonizing the curriculum has finally really taken hold. I don't say that all colleagues are moved by it, but many are. And I think more importantly, the point is that the freedom to construct your reading list in a way that's diverse and that is decolonized or reflects the history or the prehistory or the how we got here, right? When you teach property or when you teach land law, or when you teach contract, right? There's lots of ways of doing that can open up a student's mind. Now, I'm going to give a plug here to something that I wasn't involved in, but I think it's wonderful. There's a group out of Warwick produced a pocketbook, critical legal pocketbook. And it's open access. It's a PDF. You can Google it. And it's these short interventions on, virtually all areas of law that basically give you everything you need to know in terms of teaching that course in a way that is not limited to the doctrine and to the black letter and to box ticking and getting students to understand this stuff, but really to helping them, including ones that is not as obvious. My world poverty course, and even as international lawyers, right, we have such a rich trail history. I mean, it's almost impossible not to teach our topics in a way that engages more broadly with power, with hierarchy, with with exploitation. I mean, it's embedded, and we have such brilliant scholars to draw from in that area. And that my law school and our institution, as many others, fully endorse that term now. It's no longer novel, but in fact, to a certain degree, expected. And I think that opens up a good channel for doing things differently in terms of how we teach it.
Margot, I'm very conscious of the time. And so before I give you kind of the floor for the last word, as you see fit to put it, and also just because of my own selfishness, would you like to tell people where they can find your upcoming article on emancipating human rights, and also point out where people can find your previous work, and if you use Twitter and stuff, just plug.
So the peasants piece that we've been talking about came out in the London Review of International Law in late 2020. The Emancipating Human Rights, Capitalism and the Common Good is coming out in the Leiden Journal of International Law this summer. I just did the proofs. Some of the stuff on the economic culture of peasants, it emerged out of a roundtable with the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, and then I wrote up my intervention, and it's on the Third World Approaches to International Law Review blog, Reflections it's called. So that can be found there. And we didn't get to talk about, and I didn't mention, but thinking about this piece on emancipating human rights, there's really a turn to a focus on commoning, on alternative ways of doing things, on economic democracy, and it's no longer. I mean, it's still niche in a certain sense, but it's not niche in a way it was 10 years ago. There's real movement in